Welcome to Aviation Week's Check 6 podcast. I'm Joe Anselmo, editorial director. Last week, Robert Wall, Steve Trimble, and Tony Osborne riffed on defense on Check 6. So we thought we would turn the script this week and talk about all things commercial. Joining me are our senior editors Michael Bruno and Jens Flottau, and special guest Kevin Michaels, who is managing director at Aerodynamic Advisory. Welcome back to Check 6, Kevin. Michael, I want to start out with you because you wrote a column in the latest issue of Aviation Week Space Technology. Here we go. The commercial upcycle is finally here. What do you mean it's finally here? I thought it's been here a while.
Right. So technically, we've been about 5 years into this upcycle, but we're at a point right now where across the board, you're hearing from people that they finally feel like it's actually here. You know, the past 5 years have been haunted, frankly, in Western aerospace when it comes to making large airliners, haunted by false starts, bad projections, major OEMs kind of leading us to believe in January of each year that we were going to build hundreds and hundreds of aircraft and hundreds more than wound up getting built, because as each quarter would come along in these recent years, they'd have to revise their projections downward. And this kind of had a cascading effect everywhere in industry. For the longest time, nobody would believe the OEMs with their master schedules, and there were 4 or 5 master schedules floating around. There was the official one the OEMs gave, and then there was kind of the quiet one they whispered to their top tier 1 or maybe tier 2s. And then each of those companies had their own schedules and they were telling their own suppliers. And then there was the schedule about, if you just talked to somebody on the street, you went to one of the supplier conferences, said, when do you think they're actually going to get to rate, I don't know, 75 with a A320 or 50 something with a 737? And people would say, I don't know, sometime in the second half of this decade. And so we were in this bad area for several years, and now we're not anymore. And I think the kind of clarion call that the new upcycle is finally happening is, of course, the FAA's recent permission to Boeing to begin thinking about going above rate 38 to going to rate 42 in producing 737s every month. And so that, plus the durability, the stability of the supply chain, which seems to get recognized. Long story short, the upcycle's here. We can debate about how long it's going to last. I've got some ideas about that, and I definitely want to hear Kevin and Jens on it. But we're here now. There's no denying it. The upcycle has begun.
Could you tell our audience briefly why it's such a big deal that Boeing is going from 38 a month to 42? I mean, what milestone are they crossing there?
Well, they are well along in the most important milestone, and the engineers in the audience are going to hate hearing me say this, but the milestone is financial. So for this company, which is still facing a mountain of debt that it accumulated during the MAX crisis and the pandemic crisis, they have to get that mountain of debt down. And in order to do that, they've got to produce cash. And to produce cash, they got to get their number one cash cow product out the door, make more of them and deliver them. And that's the 737 MAX. So in order to produce the cash flow, they've got to get well into the 40s of producing new aircraft and delivering them every month. So with the FAA recently giving permission to get to 42, that begins to get them along the path where maybe they're finally producing positive cash flow. This year, real quick, we're recording this before Boeing gives its final quarterly results for the third quarter, but there are already expectations about how Boeing's going to do this year. They're expected to lose roughly $3 to $4 billion right now, according to most Wall Street analysts. But next year, they could actually maybe become positive cash flow, which is that big milestone of when you're finally able to take some leftover money and start working down that debt.
And maybe start developing new airplanes at some point.
Oh, sure, but that's a whole other...
Kevin Michaels, you're based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but you don't spend a lot of time in Ann Arbor. You are all over this industry, visiting companies, talking with companies. Is what you're hearing in your work what you're hearing from Michael here? Does it match?
Oh, it does. It does match. And maybe if I could broaden the perspective slightly. So Michael described what's going on in air transport production and this wonderful ramp up. But when you look at production in military and business aviation as well, we take the bigger picture. Last year, we produced, by our estimates at Aerodynamic, about $140 billion of aircraft for calendar year 2024. We estimate that by 2027, it will be $210 billion, the value of aircraft over 3 years. So that's nearly a 50% increase in the value of aircraft produced for air transport, business aviation, and military over that time. Air transport is leading that charge, but the other parts of the market are also extremely hot. And I know we'll get into MRO and aftermarket in this discussion as well, but that's also influencing what's happening also. So it's sort of like everything's firing at the same time. Some people refer to it as kind of a super cycle of sorts, just because it's so unusual that all the end user markets are growing at the same time.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about MRO. GE Aerospace had earnings this week, and they were stellar, led by MRO. I was at Aviation Week's MRO Asia Pacific Conference in Singapore. 24% higher attendance this year than last year. Our MRO Europe Conference in London, 20% higher. I mean, this industry is booming.
It's like that old adage, you go to where the money is, or, whatever it is with bank robberies, and it's sort of with MRO. By our estimates with Alton Aviation, there was about $75 billion spent by airlines on maintenance, repair, and overhaul in 2019, pre-COVID. In the most recent year, it's on the order of $125 billion. So you're looking at a 50% increase over a little bit over a 5-year period. Now, granted, some of that is price inflation, something we haven't talked about pretty much at all in MRO, which is now central to what we're looking at. So probably a rule of thumb is probably a good half of that increase is due to, price inflation, maybe more, and the rest is volume. And the big story there, of course, is engine MRO. Engine MRO used to be 40% of all maintenance spending. Today, it's over 50%. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to where that might be coming from. But without a doubt, engine MRO is sort of eating up maintenance budgets right now, and thus all the interest in every venue of your MRO conference series.
Jens Flottau, welcome from Frankfurt. You, in that same issue, Michael wrote his column. You wrote an in-depth report on Aviation Week's latest 10-year forecast for commercial aviation and MRO. And one of the tenets of that forecast was that maybe supply chain is going to slow down the growth just a little bit from what it could be.
My perspective, and I'm going to throw in some caution here. So we're all talking about this great upcycle and super cycle, and yeah, I get it. It's everything's growing right now, but let's not forget that we're still off 2018 delivery levels. So 2018, the industry did 1,792 aircraft. That's Boeing and Airbus combined. This year, they're still way below that. Next year, they're getting to it, but they're still below it in terms of, at least according to our own forecast. And 2027 will be the first year when they're actually above 2018. So, you can see how much time the industry has lost. And of course, things have been improving of late. And according to everything we know, it's going to become a lot better in the coming years. But let's not forget where we come from, and that we're still not where we were roughly 10 years ago. Also, yes, there is this big output expansion plan for the coming years, but it still depends on some crucial milestones that have yet to be met. And they don't have to do much with suppliers. They have to do with suppliers as well, of course, because of the engine constraints, mainly cabin constraints. But they also have to do with certification. The 737-7 has not yet been certified. The -10 has not been certified. All of that has to happen before production output of those two models can actually happen. The same is true for the 777-9. Airlines are desperate to get that aircraft. It's a big number of aircraft that Boeing wants to produce, yet it's not certified, and will possibly not be certified next year either. So And then the question will be, how fast can Boeing ramp up production in the wide body market? Same is true for the 787. At 7 a month right now, or something like that. It's supposed to go to, essentially double in the next few years. In Charleston alone, don't forget, Everett is no longer a final assembly line for the 787. It's all in Charleston. Can Charleston handle that? There are a lot of open questions. Can it happen? When can it happen? How fast can it happen? So let's wait and see.
If I could add to that, Joe, Jens makes a great point. It's so easy to focus on supply chain bottlenecks when, in fact, regulatory bottlenecks have become a big issue. And it's not just for new aircraft. It's for things like interior configurations. One of the reasons that there's so many, 321s, Neos sitting on the ground is that there's a shortage really of regulatory folks in EASA to certify interiors. I heard this, and I can't prove it to you, but I've heard that they had 3 people responsible for certifying interiors, and now it's down to 2. So there's a bottleneck which affects interiors, configurations. These long-haul single aisles have more bespoke interiors that requires certification to be written. They have to be approved.
And my hometown airline, Lufthansa, had, at one point 15 787s parked in Charleston because the business class seats couldn't be certified quickly enough.
Exactly.
Michael.
I would just say that what Jens and Kevin are touching on is you're hearing this common concern about restraint. It's the restraint provided by the supply chain as it downsized during the dual crisis that happened over the last 5 years. There's constraints in the workforce. It's not just having talented people, it's also having enough warm bodies in some situations. And so when Jens says, there's a lot to be seen and whether this is going to turn into a great super duper upcycle or it's just going to be an upcycle. And I kind of take this comparison from Kevin's coworker and a friend of all of ours, Richard Abalafia, who made this comment recently in another venue. He said, is this just a slow moving upcycle that will wind up being kind of normal, but it got such a slow start. And so when, the second half of this upcycle, it may seem super, but in reality, it'll just kind of be normal in the end. Or there's a potential that if the industry can get its act together when it comes to supply chain, everything from cabin interiors to castings and forgings, which Kevin knows, he knows he's forgotten more than the rest of us kind of know about this and maybe can update us on that too. But there's still questions about fasteners out there because of the plant fire that happened at the start of this year. And has that been resolved? And then meanwhile, air traffic controllers, do we have enough of them to keep the passengers flying? Lindsay Beauregard in MRO here at Aviation Week has been talking about they just can't train enough new wrench turners because there aren't enough people certified to train new people or take a test. So it's just constraints everywhere in the system. And, eventually we're probably going to come back here in a couple of years and be talking about, oh my gosh, are we just letting the greatest upcycle slip through our hands because we're not getting enough capacity and workers and regulators and certifiers all in there? Or maybe we'll come back in 2 years and say, hey, we did it. People are rising to the demand because they could see this is going to be a great upcycle.
Kevin, we opened today on such a high note, and then Michael's talking about letting this upcycle slip through our hands. Is that a real danger?
It is a danger. It is a danger. I mean, I would say in general, the supply chain has improved in its health over the last 12 to 18 months. I think most executives would acknowledge that it is in better shape today. But you do have all these wild cards, with tariffs and rare earths and God knows what else. And maybe a couple comments on that, because there was a pretty historic, maybe historic is overstating it, but there was a notable agreement just last night with the new Prime Minister of Japan, following on, I think, an agreement with Australia, which Michael can probably riff on. But this is for the U.S. and Japan to cooperate at rare earths and refining capacity and reducing regulatory burden, kind of coordinating and the like. And that's a big deal. Right now, what I would say is that with rare earths, it gets a lot of headlines. It doesn't seem to be really impacting the engine supply chain when you look at the alloys used in engines. For the most part, rare earths aren't as much of a big deal there, according to people that I've spoken to. Maybe yttrium, little trace amounts, maybe a little bit of rhenium, but not a whole lot. But where it really shows up is in electronics and with magnets and the like. And we've seen it. It's affecting the automotive industry for sure. And I think we're all waiting to see what might happen, in the aerospace industry.
And just for some European perspective here on have we let slip the opportunity, or are we going to? I think we already have to an extent, because if you look at the Airbus side, Airbus decided during COVID that it wouldn't let narrowbody production slip under the level of 40 a month, 40 aircraft a month, just to keep the supply chain going in Europe. In the first 9 months of 2025, the average number of deliveries was 43. So that's 3 more per month. That's totally underwhelming, if you ask me. And of course, the reason is, all the troubles that we know about. So if you are Airbus and you're looking back over on the last, 3-4 years, they have already lost a great opportunity to gain much more on Boeing's, on the back of Boeing's troubles. That hasn't happened.
Kevin, you mentioned headlines. Another thing in the headlines today is tariffs. I mean, just last week we saw a Canadian province took out an advertisement in the World Series, and President Donald Trump turned around and imposed 10% tariffs. And they asked the Treasury Secretary on TV, "What does this cover?" And he's like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
It's whiplash. Is this tariffs issue a danger to aerospace, or is it just a lot of noise?
I think there's a couple ways to look at that. One is sort of the financial impact. And I think it's hasn't had profound impact yet. Although if you ask someone at Pilatus in Switzerland, they might tell you otherwise because they're not exporting aircraft to the U.S. anymore. But the big markets and trading relationships, whether it's Japan or the EU, U.S., and so forth, somehow aerospace has gotten to the right people in the Trump administration and convinced them to largely exclude parts and aircraft from that. By the way, unlike the automotive industry, in my backyard, I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Ford's going to pay over $2 billion in tariffs this year. GM's going to pay $4.5 billion of tariffs. So somehow we managed to get out of that. But I'll tell you what's scary to me, and I had an epiphany last week, which is that if you think about all the non-value added activity to keep up with the tariff whiplash, which changes by the day, that adds it's a lot of people you have to add, whether you're an MRO, a small supplier, distributor, what have you. And then you layer all the sanctions, the Section 232, the environmental regulations, CMMC, which is the IT requirement for military contractors, a lot of regulations coming out of Europe as well. You layer all this on top of small suppliers, it's a huge burden. And what it might do is it might cause consolidation in the small parts of the market, whether it's MRO or production, because the regulatory burden and the non-value added activities they're getting to be enormous, and it affects scale requirements.
And I would follow up one more thing on that. You know what we're seeing with this potential decoupling that happening around the world, whether it's the US and China to a degree, but even the US and Europe, for instance, and it remains to be seen how the US-India partnership continues, and whether that gets stronger or more decoupled over time. And this adds to the concerns that it's still very hard to figure out exactly how to establish your company in an international sense going forward now. There isn't as much clarity as I think people would like. Perhaps we got through the first 6 months of the Trump administration and people have survived the tariffs. But from what I'm hearing is it's very hard for people to kind of go pull the trigger on major decisions about where to locate plants, whether to nearshore or reshore, because you could very well wake up one morning and find that President Trump has canceled all trade with Canada because he didn't like an advertisement that got placed on TV. And if you thought, wait a minute, I thought we were safe. I thought Canada was about as close of an ally as we can get, and there's even the USMCA Pact. Well, that USMCA Pact comes up for renegotiation next year, starting next year, by the way. So it seems like there is several years coming of sort of unanswered questions. And that is also going to be taxing to the industry to the degree that Kevin was talking about, that you're just having to find more people and more resources to deal with things that you didn't used to really. And the smaller your company is, the much, much harder burden it is to afford that.
And Jens, what's the sentiment in Europe? I mean, aviation has been a free trade industry for the last 40 years. Are there concerns that that's starting to fray?
Luckily, it's zero tariffs for now again. But as Michael and Kevin say, it's still very, very much in flux. The concern right now is more on the airline side, I would say, over here, as to what the tariffs and overall the end of globalization will mean for travel demand. So far, it seems it's still robust. It's okay, but airlines are already seeing yields not improving further. Transatlantic isn't as great as it used to be, like maybe in 24. So there are some signs that this is taking an effect, even though that's indirect. But still, it'll impact the industry one way or another. So yes, even if aviation got away this time, it really didn't indirectly.
Well, guys, we've covered a pretty broad waterfront in commercial today, so thank you for that. Kevin, any final words for us?
Well, I think for us to not blow this opportunity, given some of the challenges and headwinds we discussed, and I've written about this as well in Aviation Week. Why hasn't Airbus been able to take advantage of this? Because it hasn't supported its supply chain in the right way. I mean, above all, and I think it's the importance of a supplier New Deal, of recognizing the pain in the sub-tiers and doing something about it's critical. And I would highlight, maybe to end on a bit of positive news, GE, we're talking about engines. I mean, GE is moving to more of a kind of a take or pay. In other words, they're putting their money where their mouth is with their smaller suppliers, and really, maybe the Larry Culp culture and the flight deck operating system is now reaching into supply chain. And so what we're now seeing is GE putting its money up and saying, here is the issue that Michael alluded to about all the different forecasts, right? Everyone had their own forecasts. No one believed each other. They're actually putting their money where their mouth is right now. And I think that's a really positive sign that, and I'm hopeful that will help pull that part of the supply chain out of the weeds a bit.
Kevin, do you think that Airbus has learned its lesson, that they kind of didn't manage their supply chain well enough in the past, and they've now drawn their conclusions, the right conclusions?
I hope so. They get mad every time I say this. They're very sensitive about this whenever you criticize, but I still think they have big blind spots when you get down to the tier 3 level, where it's not their immediate supplier. And maybe not even some of the bigger tier 2 suppliers that supply them, but it's when you go below that where it gets really challenging. And it's just really hard. And like I like to say, if you want to understand what's happening in machine shops in tier 3, don't talk to the aircraft OEMs. Talk to the raw material suppliers and the distributors who sell directly to them, and see when they're not getting paid. Why am I not getting paid, and what's happening? They're the ones that really know what's going on in the sub tiers. I think more so than aircraft OEMs, no matter how hard they try. It's just a natural, the more layers you get removed, it's just more difficult when you have so many suppliers.
Okay, well, Kevin, thank you for coming back to Check 6. We'll have you back again. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Michael and Jens, thanks for your insights from the front lines of aviation journalism. That is a wrap for this week's Check Six. A special thanks to our podcast producer in London, Guy Fernyhough, and to our audience. Thank you for your time, and join us again next week for another Check Six.